He was 18 years old when he inherited a farm he didn't remember and a truth he couldn't have imagined. Released from the state's care with a single cardboard box of belongings, he was told the property was his only connection to a past he'd been taught to forget. But what he discovered in the root cellar of that forgotten place would unravel the story of his entire life and force him to choose between a safe escape and a dangerous inheritance. If you've ever felt like your story was written by someone else, or if you've ever had to fight for a truth that was buried, then stick around. This is for you. And if this is the kind of story that finds you when you need it, consider subscribing. We're building a community here for people who know that the hardest journeys are the ones that lead us back to ourselves. The day I turned 18 was the day I legally ceased to exist, at least as far as the state of California was concerned. For 12 years, I had been Leo, Ward number 734. My life was a collection of beige rooms, scheduled meals, and the quiet, persistent hum of institutional indifference. On my 18th birthday, that hum was replaced by the clank of a metal gate swinging shut behind me. I stood on a cracked sidewalk, holding a box that contained 2 changes of clothes, a worn copy of a book I no longer liked, and a manila envelope. The sun felt too bright, the air too thin. I had been released, but I had never felt less free. Inside the envelope was a letter from a social worker I'd met only once, a woman with tired eyes and a kind but weary smile. It explained in dry, legalistic terms that my aunt, Clara Mayhew, had passed away 2 years prior. I vaguely remembered her name, a whisper from a life before this one. She had been my guardian after my parents died, but my memories of her were fractured, like faded photographs. I remembered a warm hand and the smell of soil, and then nothing. The state had taken custody when I was 6. The official reason was neglect, a word that had branded itself onto my identity. The letter stated that her will named me as the sole inheritor of her property, a 40-acre farm in a part of the state I'd never heard of, a place called Harmony Creek. The envelope also contained a rusty key taped to a piece of cardstock and a bus ticket. That was it, my inheritance. A key to a place I couldn't picture and a one-way ticket out of the only world I knew. For a moment, I just stood there, the city noise a chaotic roar around me. I could have thrown the key in the nearest gutter, cashed in the ticket, and disappeared, become one of the thousands of kids who age out of the system and vanish into the cracks. It would have been the easy thing to do, but the word neglect echoed in my mind, a bitter, familiar ghost. I had spent 12 years believing I was abandoned, left behind because I wasn't worth the trouble. Maybe this farm, this key, was a chance to understand why. Maybe it was a chance to find something real, something that belonged to me, even if it was just a patch of dirt and a derelict house. I took a deep breath, the city exhaust filling my lungs, and walked toward the bus station. The journey was a slow bleed from gray concrete to green and gold hills. I watched the sprawling cityscape shrink in the grimy window of the Greyhound, replaced by endless fields and the occasional cluster of buildings that constituted a town. With every mile, the knot of anxiety in my stomach tightened. What was I walking into? A house full of ghosts? A pile of debt? The social worker's letter had been vague, offering no details about the farm's condition or financial status. It was a blank slate, and I wasn't sure if that was a gift or a curse. I arrived in Harmony Creek just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and bruised purple. The town was little more than a main street with a handful of storefronts, a grocery, a diner with a flickering neon sign, a hardware store, and a post office. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, full of unspoken histories. The farm was another 2 miles out of town. No bus went that far. I walked, my box under one arm, the setting sun at my back. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The road turned from cracked asphalt to gravel, and finally, I saw it. A weathered wooden sign, half swallowed by overgrown ivy, read, "Mayhew Farms." Beyond it, a long dirt driveway led to a silhouette against the twilight sky. A two-story farmhouse, its shoulders slumped like a tired old man, stood beside a large, sway-backed barn. The place wasn't just neglected, it felt wounded. Paint peeled from the siding like sunburnt skin, windows were dark and vacant, weeds choked what might have once been a garden. This wasn't a home, it was a ruin. My heart sank. This was my legacy? A monument to the failure that had defined my life. I walked up the sagging porch steps, the wood groaning under my weight. The rusty key felt cold and alien in my hand. It took some jiggling, a bit of force, but the lock finally turned with a painful shriek of metal. I pushed the door open and the smell hit me first. It was the smell of trapped time. Dust, dry rot, and the faint, ghostly scent of wood smoke and lavender. I stepped inside, into the deep shadows of the entryway. Moonlight filtered through the dirty windows, illuminating floating dust motes and the spectral shapes of furniture draped in white sheets. It was a tomb. I dropped my box by the door and just stood there, listening to the house settle around me. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the eaves, felt like a judgment. I spent that first night on a dusty couch, not even bothering to pull off the sheet. I didn't sleep. I just lay there staring into the darkness, the feeling of being an intruder in my own life more acute than ever. The next morning I began to explore. It was a slow, methodical process, like peeling back layers of forgetting. I pulled the sheets off the furniture, revealing solid, handcrafted wooden pieces. A dining table that could seat 10, a heavy oak desk in a small study, a rocking chair by a cold stone fireplace. In the kitchen, jars of what had once been preserves lined the shelves, their contents faded and murky. It was a house that had been lived in, loved in, but it had been left in a hurry. A coffee cup sat on the counter, a book lay open on a nightstand. It was as if the occupant had just stepped out for a moment and never returned. In the study, I found the first real clue. Tucked inside a desk drawer beneath a stack of old seed catalogs was an envelope with my name on it. Leo. My aunt's handwriting was a steady, elegant script. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter was dated just a few weeks before she died. "My dearest Leo," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone and you have come home. I know you must have so many questions. I know you must hate me. The story you were told, the one about neglect, is the story I had to let them write. It was the only way to keep you safe. I never stopped loving you, not for a single moment. I need you to understand that. This farm is more than just land and a house. It is a legacy, and it is in danger. There are people who want this land, people who have wanted it for a long time. They will try to take it from you. They will offer you money. It will seem like an easy way out of a hard life, and I won't blame you if you take it. But before you decide, you need to know the truth. Everything you need is here. Start in the root cellar. Be strong, my boy. Your roots are deeper than you know." I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through my tears. Safe? What had she been protecting me from? And who were these people who wanted the farm? The letter raised more questions than it answered, but it also planted a seed of something I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The anger I'd held onto for so long, the cold, hard stone of abandonment in my chest, began to crack. She hadn't thrown me away, she had hidden me. The root cellar, the doors were outside, a pair of heavy, slanted wooden panels set into the earth at the back of the house. They were swollen with years of rain and neglect, and it took me the better part of an hour with a crowbar from the shed to pry one of them open. A wave of cool, damp air washed over me, smelling of earth and potatoes and something else, something metallic and old. I found a flashlight in the kitchen, its beam weak and flickering, and descended the steep stone steps into the darkness. The cellar was larger than I expected. Stone walls, cool and damp to the touch, lined a space filled with empty shelves and rotting wooden crates. The air was thick and still. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the packed dirt floor, expecting to find nothing more than what my aunt's letter had promised: a place to start. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a stack of splintered pallets, was a section of the floor that looked different. The dirt was slightly more disturbed, the color a shade darker. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dropped to my knees and started digging with my bare hands. The soil was cold and compacted. It took time, my fingers growing numb and raw, but eventually they hit something hard. Metal. I dug faster, a frantic energy seizing me. It was a box. A heavy steel footlocker, the kind soldiers use. It was locked, of course, with a thick, rusty padlock. For a moment, despair washed over me. I had no key, no way to open it. Then I remembered the shed. I scrambled back up the steps, my eyes blinking in the sudden daylight, and rummaged through the chaos of old tools until I found a hammer and a heavy-duty chisel. Back in the cellar, the sound of steel striking steel was deafening in the enclosed space. I hammered at the lock, sweat stinging my eyes, frustration mounting with every failed blow. Finally, with a sharp crack, the shackle gave way. The lock fell to the dirt floor with a dull thud. I paused, my breath ragged. This was it. The truth my aunt had promised. I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, my breath caught in my throat. It was filled with money, stacks of cash, bundled in rubber bands, 50s and hundreds, more money than I had ever seen in my life. I reached in and touched it, half expecting it to turn to dust. It was real. I had no idea how much was there, but it had to be tens of thousands, maybe more. A way out, a way to start over anywhere I wanted. But beneath the bundles of cash, there was something else. A thick, leather-bound journal and another envelope, this one yellowed with age. I pulled it out first. It was addressed not to me, but to a lawyer, a Mr. Abernathy in a neighboring county. Tucked inside with the letter was a newspaper clipping. The headline was stark: Harmony Creek Mill closes. Viridian Development buys assets. The article, dated 15 years ago, detailed how a massive corporation had bought the town's primary employer, the local lumber mill, only to shut it down, taking hundreds of jobs with it. The name Viridian Development rang a faint bell, but I couldn't place it. I set the envelope aside and picked up the journal. The first page had an inscription: "For Leo, so you know who you come from." I opened it and began to read my aunt's story. The story of the farm, of the town, and of a fight that had cost her everything. The story that was now somehow mine. The money in the box wasn't an escape. I was beginning to understand that. It was ammunition. The journal was my aunt's entire life, written in the same steady hand as the letter I'd found in the desk. It started with entries about the seasons, the planting and the harvesting, the simple, hard rhythm of life on the farm. She wrote about my parents, her brother and his wife, and their love for this land. She wrote about their accident, a logging truck on a rain-slicked road, and the profound, world-shattering grief of losing them. And then she wrote about me, about taking in a heartbroken little boy, about trying to build a new family from the wreckage of the old one. The pages were filled with love, with small anecdotes about things I'd said, games we'd played, memories that were buried so deep in me I could only feel their ghosts. Reading her words, it was like someone was gently excavating my own lost childhood. Then, about a year after she became my guardian, the tone of the journal began to change. The entries became shorter, more anxious. She wrote about the mill closing. The economic heart of Harmony Creek had been ripped out by Viridian Development, a faceless corporation from the city. At first, it was just about the hardship. Friends losing their jobs, families leaving town, storefronts on Main Street being boarded up. The quiet, heavy silence I'd felt when I arrived. This was where it started. Viridian made a public statement promising to reinvest, to bring new opportunities. But they never did. Instead, they started buying up land, cheaply. They sent representatives, men in sharp suits with predatory smiles, to make offers on the farms and properties ringing the now defunct mill. They preyed on people's desperation. Many sold. They took the lowball offers because they had no choice. They needed to feed their families, to move somewhere with work. My aunt refused. The Mayhew farm had been in our family for 100 years. It wasn't just a business, it was an identity. But her refusal made her a target. The entries in the journal grew darker. She wrote about strange cars driving slowly past the property at night, about her well water starting to taste strange, metallic, about livestock getting sick. She wasn't a scientist, but she was a farmer. She knew the land, she knew the water. She suspected Viridian hadn't just shut the mill down. They had left a toxic legacy behind. The company had used harsh chemicals for treating the lumber, and she believed they had improperly disposed of them, letting them seep into the groundwater, into the creek that gave the town its name. She started documenting everything. She took water samples and paid a lab in another state to test them. She interviewed other farmers who had noticed the same things but were too afraid to speak up. She was building a case, piece by piece, a quiet one-woman war against a corporate giant. This was the woman they called neglectful, this fierce, intelligent, brave woman who was fighting for her home, for her town. The shame I felt was a physical weight. The journal detailed how the pressure from Viridian escalated. They went from making offers to making threats. First, it was legal notices, claims of property line disputes. Then it became more personal. A lawyer representing the company, a man named Marcus Thorne, began a campaign of harassment. He was the architect of their strategy, a man whose name was written with a sharp, angry press of her pen. He was the one who started digging into her life, looking for leverage. And he found it. He found me. The entries from that time were agonizing to read. She knew they would use me against her. They would claim she was an unfit guardian, that her obsession with Viridian was endangering a child. They would paint her as unstable, a conspiracy theorist. And in a closed, conservative family court system, a single woman with no money against a corporation with endless legal resources, she knew she would lose. And worse, she feared for my safety. What if their threats escalated beyond the legal? The journal entry from the night she made her decision was smudged with what I knew were tear stains. "They will take him," she wrote. "One way or another, they will use him to break me. I cannot let that happen. I can't protect him if he's here. The only way to keep him safe is to let him go. They will call it neglect. They will call me a failure. Let them. He will be safe in the system, away from them, away from this fight. It is the only choice. It is the last gift I can give him. I will lose him to save him." I closed the journal, my whole body shaking. The story of my life, the narrative of abandonment that had shaped every part of me, was a lie. It wasn't a story of neglect. It was a story of sacrifice. A deliberate, calculated act of love so profound it had required her to destroy her own reputation, to break her own heart. I cried then. Not the quiet, choked-off tears of the orphanage, but wrenching, gut-emptying sobs. I cried for the little boy who had felt so utterly alone. I cried for the woman who had given up everything for him. I cried for the 12 years we had lost. When the tears finally subsided, a new feeling began to settle in its place. A cold, hard anger. Viridian development hadn't just poisoned the water. They had poisoned my life. They had stolen my family, and they were still here. Just yesterday, another letter had arrived in the rusted mailbox at the end of the driveway. It was from them, a formal, generous-sounding offer to buy the farm. They were still trying to bury their secrets under a pile of money. I looked at the box of cash on the floor. I looked at the journal, and I looked at the envelope addressed to Mr. Abernathy. My aunt had left me everything I needed. She had left me the proof, the resources, and most importantly, she had left me a choice. I could take the money and run, disappear and build a new life free from all of this. No one would blame me. It was the sensible thing to do. Or I could stay. I could pick up the fight she had been forced to abandon. I could use what she had left me to seek not just compensation, but justice. For her, for the town, for the 6-year-old boy who never got to say goodbye. The choice felt immense, a weight that could either crush me or forge me into someone new. I walked out of the cellar and into the bright afternoon sun. The farm looked different now. It wasn't a ruin anymore. It was a battlefield. It was a promise. It was home. That night, I made a phone call. I found the number for Abernathy and Sons, attorneys at law, online. A calm, professional voice answered. "Mr. Abernathy, please, my name is Leo Mayhew. It's about my Aunt Clara." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I've been expecting your call, son," a kind, gravelly voice finally said. The next day, I drove my aunt's old, dusty pickup truck. The keys had been hanging on a hook in the kitchen all along, to Mr. Abernathy's office. It was a small, unassuming building in the next town over, filled with the smell of old paper and coffee. Mr. Abernathy was an older man with kind eyes that had seen a lot and a firm, reassuring handshake. I laid the journal, the envelope, and the newspaper clipping on his desk. He nodded slowly as I told him everything I had found, everything I had read. He wasn't surprised. "Clara was a remarkable woman," he said when I finished. "Stubborn as a mule and smarter than anyone gave her credit for. She came to me years ago when this all started. She knew what Viridian was doing, but proof was the hard part. This," he said, tapping the journal, "this is her legacy, her proof." He explained the legal situation in stark terms. Viridian was now a multi-billion-dollar corporation. They had an army of lawyers. Marcus Thorne, the man from the journal, was now one of their top executives. A lawsuit would be a war of attrition. It would be long, expensive, and ugly. They would try to discredit my aunt, to discredit me. "They made you an offer on the farm, I assume?" he asked. I nodded. "A generous one, I'd wager. Enough to make a young man with nothing think all his dreams have come true." "It was," I admitted. "Then they'll make another, even bigger one, once they know you've contacted me. They want to bury this, Leo. They want that farm because it's the heart of the matter. The water contamination is worse there, closest to the old mill site. Your aunt's well is ground zero. Owning it means they control the evidence." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Clara left you that money for a reason. It's enough to pay the back taxes on the farm, make the house livable, and fund the start of this legal fight. But it won't last forever. If you do this, you'll be choosing a very difficult path. They will come after you." "What happens if I don't?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What happens if I sell?" "You sign a non-disclosure agreement," he said flatly. "You take the money and you walk away forever. You can never speak of what you know, of what your aunt discovered. Viridian gets the land, they remediate it just enough to pass a cursory inspection, and then they build whatever they plan to build. A luxury resort, a housing development, and the truth of what they did to this community stays buried right here," he tapped the journal again, "in this book. We are all, at some point in our lives, faced with a moment like this. A moment where the path splits and the choice we make defines not just our future, but who we are. One path is easy, well lit, and promises comfort. The other is dark, uncertain, and demands sacrifice. I think a lot of us are taught to choose the easy path, to prioritize our own safety, our own comfort, and there's no shame in that. Survival is a powerful instinct. But what happens when the easy path requires you to leave a piece of your soul behind? What happens when it means betraying the memory of someone you love? I've been reading the comments on some of my past stories, and so many of you have talked about these moments. About choosing to care for a sick parent instead of taking a dream job. About speaking up against an injustice at work, knowing it could get you fired. About walking away from a comfortable but toxic relationship. These are the choices that build character. They're the moments that prove what we're made of. And as I sat there in that quiet lawyer's office, I knew I was at my own crossroads. Now, let's get back to the farm. I looked at Mr. Abernathy, at this man my aunt had trusted, and I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in my entire life. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was smaller than the anger. and it was much, much smaller than the love I felt for the woman I was only just getting to know. "I'm not selling," I said. The words felt solid, real. "She didn't raise me to be a coward. Even when she wasn't there, she was raising me. Everything she did was to give me this choice. I'm not going to let her down." A slow smile spread across Mr. Abernathy's face. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. "Your aunt left very specific instructions. She knew you better than you think. She knew you'd fight." The first step was to pay the property taxes. It was a huge sum that had been accumulating for years. Walking into the county clerk's office and writing that check with the money from the steel box felt like firing the first shot in the war. It solidified my claim to the land. It announced that Mayhew Farms was not abandoned. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Mr. Abernathy filed the initial lawsuit, a preliminary injunction to prevent Viridian from attempting any further action related to the property. As he predicted, their response was swift. The polite offer letters stopped. They were replaced by letters from their legal team filled with threats and accusations. And then Marcus Thorne himself came to the farm. He arrived in a sleek black sedan that looked completely alien, parked next to my aunt's rusty pickup. He was exactly as I'd pictured him. Expensive suit, polished shoes, and cold reptilian eyes. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Mayhew," he said, his voice smooth and condescending, "you're making a grave mistake. You're a child playing a game you don't understand. I understand that your company poisoned this town and destroyed my family," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I understand that you're trespassing on my property." He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "This property is a worthless pile of dirt. We are prepared to offer you $750,000, a clean break, a chance for you to go be whoever you want to be, anywhere in the world. All you have to do is sign a few papers." It was a staggering amount of money, enough to make me pause. I thought about the beige rooms, the threadbare clothes, the constant feeling of having nothing. That money could erase all of it. But then I thought of my aunt's tear-stained journal entry. I thought of her giving up her whole life just to give me this one choice. "The farm is not for sale," I said. Thorne's smile vanished. "You have no idea what you're up against," he hissed. "We will bury you in legal fees. We will drag your aunt's name through the mud. We will prove she was a delusional, neglectful woman who endangered a child. By the time we're done, you'll have nothing. Not the money, not the farm, nothing." He got back in his car and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. His threats lingered in the air long after he was gone. I was terrified, but I was also more determined than ever. I wasn't just fighting for the past anymore. I was fighting for my future on this land. I started working on the farm itself. The money my aunt left wasn't just for lawyers, it was for life. I knew that if I was going to stay here, I had to make this place a home, not just a headquarters for a lawsuit. I started small. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, letting in the light and air. I repaired the leaking roof, replaced the broken window panes. I tilled the small patch of land by the house that had been her garden, my hands in the same soil she had worked for years. It was hard, physical labor. My body ached in ways it never had before. But with every nail I hammered, every weed I pulled, I felt more connected to this place, to her. I was slowly, painstakingly bringing it back to life, and in doing so, I was bringing myself back to life too. The community, what was left of it, started to take notice. At first, they were wary. I was an outsider, the ghost of a family long gone. But they saw the lights on in the old Mayhew house. They saw the smoke curling from the chimney on cold mornings. They saw me in town, buying supplies at the hardware store, my clothes covered in dirt and paint. An older man named Gus, who ran the local diner, was the first to approach me. He'd known my aunt. "She was a good woman, your Clara," he said one afternoon, setting a cup of coffee down in front of me. "A fighter, stubborn, but she fought for what was right." I told him what I was doing. I told him about the lawsuit. I expected him to tell me I was crazy, to warn me off. Instead, he just nodded. "It's about time," he said quietly. "A lot of us knew. We were beaten down, scared. You've got more of her in you than you know." The next day, Gus showed up at the farm with 2 other men. They didn't say much. They just got out of their truck, pulled out their tools, and helped me finish fixing the porch. It was the beginning. Word spread through the quiet valley. The story of Clara's fight, of the evidence she'd collected, of the son who had come back to finish it. People started talking. Old stories were unearthed. Other families who had gotten sick, whose wells had gone bad, who had been silenced by Viridian's money and lawyers, started to remember their anger. Mr. Abernathy's phone began to ring. One by one, other plaintiffs joined the lawsuit. We were no longer one boy against a corporation. We were a community. The legal battle was everything Thorne had promised it would be, brutal and slow. Viridian's lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to bankrupt us, to exhaust us. They did try to smear my aunt's name, presenting the state's neglect finding as proof of her instability. But we had her journal. We had her meticulous records. And now we had the testimony of a dozen other families. Mr. Abernathy was brilliant, a small-town lawyer with the heart of a lion. He countered their every move. Meanwhile, I focused on the farm. I learned from old books in the study and from the quiet advice of my new neighbors. I learned how to read the weather, how to mend a fence, how to bring depleted soil back to health. I planted a small crop of vegetables, the first real harvest the farm had seen in over a decade. Selling those vegetables at the local farmers market felt like a bigger victory than any courtroom skirmish. It was proof of life, proof of a future. I was creating something, not just fighting against something. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of legal depositions, I came home exhausted. I was sitting on the newly repaired porch, watching the fireflies begin to dot the twilight, when I realized something profound. I wasn't haunted anymore. The ghosts of the past were still there, but they weren't threatening. They were comforting. My aunt's presence was in the solid feel of the porch beneath me, in the scent of the honeysuckle she had planted, in the fierce loyalty I felt for this land. I had come here looking for answers about why I had been left behind. But I had found something far more important. I had found where I belonged. The fight wasn't over. It would likely go on for years, but it didn't matter. Viridian had taken my childhood, but they couldn't take my home. I had put down roots in the very soil they had tried to poison. The lawsuit stretched on for 2 more years. It was a slow, grinding war. Viridian threw everything they had at us. They hired private investigators to dig into my life, into the lives of the other plaintiffs. They tried to buy off witnesses. They buried us in paperwork. There were days I wanted to give up. The financial strain was immense, the emotional toll even greater. I poured every cent I had from my aunt's box, and then every cent I earned from the farm, into the legal fund. I learned to live simply, to find satisfaction not in possessions, but in the slow, steady work of reclamation. The farm became my sanctuary. When the legal maneuvering became too much, I would go out into the fields. I would feel the sun on my back, the dirt under my fingernails, and I would remember what I was fighting for. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. It was about the idea that you can't just break a place, poison its people, and then pave it over with a golf course. The community rallied in ways I could never have imagined. We held fundraisers, potluck dinners, bake sales to support the legal costs. Gus put a donation jar on the counter of his diner. People who had next to nothing gave what they could. We were all in it together, bound by a shared history and a shared hope for justice. The turning point came when a former employee from the old mill, a man who had been living with a guilty conscience for 15 years, came forward. He had been one of the foremen in charge of waste disposal. He had the original disposal logs, documents he had saved, showing that Viridian had ordered them to dump the chemicals directly into unlined pits, knowing they would seep into the groundwater. It was the smoking gun. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the prospect of a public relations nightmare, Viridian finally agreed to settle. It wasn't the glorious courtroom victory I had sometimes imagined. There was no dramatic verdict, no public shaming of Marcus Thorne. It was a quiet, negotiated agreement signed in a sterile conference room. But the terms were everything we had fought for. They agreed to pay a substantial settlement to every family involved in the suit. They were forced to fund a comprehensive, long-term cleanup of the entire area, overseen by an independent environmental agency. And they had to issue a public acknowledgement of their role in the contamination. It wasn't an apology, but it was the truth, finally brought into the light. The day the settlement was announced, the whole town gathered in the little park on Main Street. There were tears and hugs. There was a sense of profound collective relief. We hadn't just won some money, we had reclaimed our story. We had forced the powerful to be accountable. Gus clapped me on the back, his eyes shining. "Clara would be so damn proud of you, kid," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, at the people who had become my family. They weren't just neighbors anymore, they were fellow soldiers. We had fought a war together, and we had won. In the end, the story wasn't about the money I found in a box. It wasn't even about the lawsuit. It was about what it means to inherit something. We tend to think of inheritance as property or wealth, but the most important things we inherit are often invisible. We inherit stories. We inherit struggles. We inherit the consequences of choices made by those who came before us. My Aunt Clara didn't leave me a fortune. She left me a choice. She left me a responsibility. She left me a chance to finish the work she started, to stand for something. That's an inheritance that can't be measured in dollars. It's measured in character, in purpose, in the quiet satisfaction of knowing you did the right thing, no matter how hard it was. Today, the farm is thriving. I've expanded the garden, replanted the old orchard, and started a small herd of dairy goats. The house is no longer a ruin, it's a home filled with light and warmth. Harmony Creek is slowly coming back to life too. Some of the families who left are starting to return. New businesses are opening up on Main Street. The cleanup is a long process, but the work has begun. The creek is running clearer, the land is healing, and so are its people. I still think about that first day, standing on the sidewalk with that cardboard box, feeling utterly lost. I had no idea then that the greatest gift I would ever receive was a rusty key to a broken-down house. It led me not just to the truth about my past, but to the person I was always meant to be. Every single one of us has an inheritance of some kind. Maybe it's a story you were told about your family, a value that was passed down, or a struggle you feel called to take on. It's the part of your past that shapes your present, and the choice you have is what you do with it. Do you accept it? Do you fight it? Or do you transform it into something new? I want you to think about that. What have you inherited, and what are you choosing to do with it? Let me know in the comments below. Your stories matter. They are a part of the community we're building here, a place for people who aren't afraid of the hard truths or the difficult paths. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in fighting for what's right and in the power of second chances, I hope you'll subscribe and join us. Because we all have a story to reclaim, and sometimes the most valuable treasures are the ones that are buried, waiting for us to have the courage to start digging.